All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you could please take a seat. That means you, Nicholas. Don't go to get a beer. Please take a seat. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank everybody for coming. When you look to schedule and put on an enterprise type event, you never know exactly what's going to happen. So this turnout is really exciting for us. And again, thank you. There's some folks at Rocket Space that helped put this on. Laura, she's downstairs. I think she helped you check in. If you see her after the talk, please thank her because the folks at Rocket Space have been great to help put this on as well. My name is Gregory Love. I am on the platform team here at Yammer. Let's see, Norman Shah over here with his hand up, and Sid Singh. Please turn around and everybody point and look at Sid. Yes, there he is. We are also, those two are on the platform team as well. So if you're building an enterprise product, you're in your early days, please, I know we've already spoke to several of you, but come find us. Would love to talk about our platform, how that may be able to help you out from a growth and user acquisition standpoint. Or if you're interested in connecting with any of our engineers or other PMs just around the lessons we've learned from building in the enterprise for the last 5 years, would be happy to make those connections as well. So we're excited today to have Jason Shah come and talk to you around some of those lessons we've learned and how we actually build our product. Jason joined us about 1.5 years ago. Prior to that, he was actually at another TechCrunch Disrupt winner, Quickie, for a short period of time. Before that, you had started, I believe, a tutoring, I Need a Pencil, that was acquired by another company. So he's done quite a bit. He also has Heat Tracker, Heat Data. I'm following it up. It's Heat Data. Is on the board of the Computer Science Museum. And he has all these, like, this incredibly impressive resume, but he can't help me fix some basic JavaScript errors on my own website. So, give him a hard time about that. But we're really pleased to have him up here. So please welcome Jason to the stage.
Thanks, Greg, for the generous and confused introduction. Apparently, I just do a bunch of random things. So yeah, like Greg said, my name is Jason Shah. I'm a product manager here at Yammer. Yammer, for those that don't know, is an enterprise social network. So for those who know the cloud days of like the 80s and 90s, imagine like an intranet that's in the cloud, or a not so sexy looking Facebook, for those who have used the product, to be very honest about our product. But anyway, tonight we're going to be talking about building for the enterprise. So how many of you are working on your own SaaS products right now? Cool. And how many of you work for just a big enterprise software company? Okay, great. So Yammer is at this interesting nexus of sort of consumer and enterprise, right? And the way we build software is very much informed by the way that Facebook builds product, but also the way that a big company like Microsoft has built product. And many of you know that we were acquired by Microsoft last year. And so one of our mandates is very much to teach them and teach the larger Microsoft organization how to build product. So if I can make the slides work, aside from, apparently I can't make slides work or use JavaScript. Turn on the clicker, that would be a great idea. Yeah, I should have expected that. I think it's on, but now it's on. Right there. All right, cool, great. Thanks, Taylor. All right, so we'll briefly talk about Yammer. We'll talk about why the enterprise is hard, right? What are the challenges that come with trying to build an enterprise company? Enterprise is certainly sexy. It's back. There's a bunch of venture money flowing into it. A lot of startups. There's now multiple accelerators for enterprise companies. Companies like Microsoft have started things like the Bing Fund to fund these sort of companies. So it's back, and it's sexy, and it's great because you actually make real money before you hit like 10 million users and turn on ads. But it's hard, and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about how Yammer builds product. Basically, how do we brainstorm and come up with ideas? How do we actually test and validate those ideas? It's a very new concept in the enterprise to actually run A/B tests and understand how people use your product. And how do you use your customers as partners? That's one great advantage in the enterprise, that you have people paying you real money and validating the value of what you're providing, and they can actually be a real asset in even building your product in addition to evangelizing it. So here's just a screenshot for basic feed of Yammer. Yammer started in 2008, and when it first came out, it launched at TechCrunch 50. A lot of people thought it was just a toy. It seems obvious now, especially after such a large acquisition, that, oh, of course companies would want an enterprise social network. But many of you may be facing the same sort of criticism that Yammer faced when it first came out. How is this useful for my business? Why is it better than the incumbent software I've been paying for the past 10 years? So Yammer went through many of those same challenges, and 5 years later, here we are, in analyst reports about how Yammer is actually useful to business productivity and so on. One of the things that we'll be talking about today, how many people here have used Yammer before, by the way? You don't have to just say that because you're here. So one of our features, so that you might be able to see in the top left, there's an envelope. I didn't put a screenshot of it. We have this feature called Inbox that has been around for about the past year. And it's a really great case study that we've gone through in terms of how do you build a product, how do you test it, how do you listen to your customers and balance feedback from them. So we'll be using that through the rest of the night, but basically imagine something similar to your email inbox, but the way that Yammer works is that it's open, right? And there are a lot of public conversations. So instead, imagine a little bit more of an advanced inbox like email, but you also have group conversations in there, announcements from admins, and things like that. So why is it so hard to build for the enterprise, right? To start with, you have diverse customers. Yammer has more than 200,000 networks that are using our product, and that goes from small startups all the way through your largest Fortune 500, right? So when you have that, how do you possibly build a product that is easy for, say, a team of like 10 people to use and prefer over something like a HipChat or some other simple IM client? But it also works for a company like Microsoft of 90,000 people. There are some real product trade-offs to make there, and it's not as simple as saying, well, we're only going to go after this one vertical, because sometimes a business isn't just viable if you only build an enterprise social network for startups or an enterprise social network for angry journalists at TechCrunch. They haven't necessarily been the biggest fans because there's always an easy opportunity to find fault with a product that's trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people. So how do you deal with that? And we'll talk through that a little bit. Decoupled buyer and end user, right? As much as consumerization has become a big buzzword, and Aaron Levy loves to write TechCrunch articles about it, and it is a real thing, it's still true that there are buyers and there are users, and they're not always the same person. So Yammer often faces the challenge of how do you appease the IT buyer or the head of a line of business, but how do you also build a highly engaging product? So we'll oftentimes have people start using Yammer as a free product, right, in a certain part of their company, and it does eventually grow and grow, and this is the whole freemium viral story. And then eventually you sell into IT or somebody who can really put down, whether it's a credit card or fill out a form to pay for the service. But we have to make both of those parties happy, and sometimes there are competing interests. So that leads right into bundled product needs and contract requirements. So early on in Yammer's history, there was the notion of moderated networks, and this is the idea that you would limit whether or not somebody could invite somebody. And a lot of companies actually wanted this because they weren't used to the idea that one coworker could just invite somebody else, and how do I control this and all this? But as a product, as a social network, how do you possibly build a social network without virality? So you'll often find as you build enterprise software that your end users and what they need a full, rich network of their coworkers, and your buyers are going to have different needs, and your contracts are going to dictate and stipulate sometimes things that are going to hinder your product. So how do you navigate those waters? Limited growth channels. So I mentioned the virality piece. Take a product like whether it's Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. When you have a consumer product like that, growth isn't necessarily easy, but you have a ton of channels available to you, right? You have all the social media channels. You have address book imports. Path recently got in trouble for that, but their trouble is a slap on the wrist and a couple bad press articles. In our case, we could lose customers. You could get sued. It could be a real nightmare. So how do you, in the enterprise environment, figure out how to grow? And Greg was mentioning the Yammer platform. And there are a number of other ways, though, in the enterprise how you achieve that growth, but it's not quite as straightforward as copying Snapchat's growth playbook. And then what about legacy systems and expectations, right? So in the case of Yammer, we release, often, weekly, sometimes multiple times in a day, we'll release new code. Enterprise customers aren't used to that. They sign a contract and they pay for a specific product, and they're used to the world of 3-year releases and XYZ 2013 or whatever it would be, and their product's they're not expecting it to change. But nowadays, with the cloud and with A/B testing and everything else, you might have a customer who has multiple people within their company seeing different versions of the product, for example, and they're not used to that. So we'll talk through a little bit, how do you deal with those sort of expectations, as well as systems, right? Right now, Ruby on Rails is the greatest thing, and A/B testing we were talking about. But imagine if you have to build a product that integrates well with, I don't know, some SharePoint client from like 2004. There are legacy systems that are already in place, and large vendors have already entrenched themselves inside of the companies you're trying to sell to. So no matter how beautifully designed your enterprise app is, or no matter how productive you think it might make a company's employees, you're going to have to run into these problems about legacy systems. And it's not as simple as just hand waving and saying, well, we're 10x better because so and so invested in us, so you should just abandon all the software that you're already using. Cool. So this is briefly one version of telling the story about how we build product. For those that aren't familiar with our development methodology, we basically tend to work, people have heard of the term agile. It's a version of that where we often have cross-functional teams. So you have a product manager, you have 2 to 10 engineers, you have somebody from the analytics. So some of you folks have heard of like data science, and we might talk about that a little bit as well. So we have these teams that come together for short periods of time, like 2 to 10 weeks, to build specific features that we've prioritized. And PMs, product managers, are often working on, say, 5 features at a time. And they are working across the product as well, not just, oh, this is a web product manager and this is a mobile one. Our product managers work throughout the entire suite. And so with that in mind, we mainly focus on 3 different aspects of building product. And this is how I put it. I realize that multifaceted ideation is probably the worst sounding phrase ever. So just realize that it's the notion of balanced brainstorming, and we'll talk more about what it means. Because you have customers, right, as an enterprise product, but you also have user research that you might have done with individual people who might just be prospects. And then you also have data on how people are using your product. And then at the end of the day, you also have a vision. So how do you balance all of those things together? Product experiments. So we talked about A/B testing before. How do you actually use those experiments to not just, the Google test of like, 40, 50 shades of blue? Like, how do you do real experiments that validate your hypotheses about user behavior? We'll talk about that. And then we mentioned customers as partners. So, I mentioned earlier that Yammer sits somewhere between consumer and enterprise, right? So if you're building a consumer product, it's very common that, this brilliant team of Facebookers and Apple, employees and product people and engineers will come together and they'll brainstorm the future of how, say enterprise communication should work, or build Snapchat or whatever. They'll build a product. And then the other end of the spectrum, in enterprise, traditionally, you've had people basically go to a customer, they get requirements, they write them all down, they say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and then they come back maybe a year later and say, okay, we delivered this, please buy it, or hopefully you got a more secure handshake than that. Yammer believes in something a little bit more balanced than that, right? Because if we just built what our customers asked for, we would have never built the product in the first place. The first version basically just looked like an enterprise Twitter. And as I mentioned, people just thought it was a toy. So you want to talk with customers, use data, and drive towards a vision. So talking with customers, customers are hard in enterprise, right? Not only because they have just requirements for you, but they also come to you oftentimes with solutions. So it's really hard to just say, okay, sure, we'll go and build that, when really you should be looking for problems. Notice that it doesn't say listen to and it doesn't say talk to, it says talk with. So it's very easy to listen to, jot down the requirements. It's very easy to talk to and say, hey, here's our great enterprise product and here's our pricing sheet, just buy it. And maybe 1 out of 1,000 will sign up and you say, hey, great, we grew revenue infinite in the last month. That doesn't really fly. When you're working with customers, you want to ask them about what are their problems, what's their day-to-day, and not really have a sense necessarily for how your product is what they need. If you focus on your product, it's really easy to just pigeonhole them and say, so you need an enterprise social network, right? And whether they say yes or no, you haven't gotten anything useful out of them. Instead, if you ask them, well, tell me about your day at work. Tell me about the problems you face with your coworkers. And you want to solicit the right sort of open-ended information from your customers. In the case, so I mentioned our inbox feature before. We started to talk to our customers and do user research and find out that, oh, Yammer's great, but as our network grows, it's really hard to keep on top of everything. So once you start to hear that sort of thing, it's like, okay, there's a real problem. If you otherwise listen to a customer, they might say, yeah, there's a lot to keep track of. Can you just build a toggle for what goes in my feed? Or can you let me customize, can you let me drag and drop things? Before you know it, you don't even know what your product looks like, because every version for every customer looks different. So for us, we saw this problem, and then it was up to us as a product team to figure out, well, what do we do with this? So pulling data, right? When you're early stage startup, you're using maybe say Mixpanel, Kissmetrics, Google Analytics. At Yammer, we have an in-house solution basically because the scale of the data is so large. But at the end of the day, the story is the same. You can pull data about how people are using your product, and if they're prospects, you can do market research and figure out numbers. If you're figuring out, do we go iOS or Android first? Figure out, okay, not only global market share, but for our specific vertical, for our specific problem, what's the right answer? In the case with our inbox feature, we were able to see, well, people do in fact have a lot of messages, but what types do they have, right? Is it mainly private messages? Is it mainly group messages? Are people using the other features that we have, like announcements and polls, so that we would need to build a lot of rich functionality into this inbox, or could it be a pretty straightforward message-based inbox instead? So you want to listen to your customers, but then hopefully you also have some data to back up what actually needs to be built for them. Because even if you have a problem in mind, without any data behind what the rest of your user base could benefit from, it might just be an n equals 5 situation, and only say 5% of your customers, or 5 period of your customers, have a certain problem. So it's really important to complement the customer stories that you solicit with data. And I know that's a challenge for especially small startups. It's like, well, nobody's using our product. How do we pull data on nothing? But there is always some form of information out there, and it's really important to gather that and pair that with the other inputs that you have. So this is related to the previous point about pulling data, but you want to monitor usage. So take a product like Groupon, right? One of the more famous pivots in history. They started out basically as a platform for building traction behind social movements. Now, it might not be that inspirational that they went on to build a daily deal site, but what they did was they watched how people were actually using their product, and it turns out that it wasn't, building a lot of traction for anti-NSA petitions, or it was, I mean, of course, that wasn't a public issue at the time, but it was that people were actually sharing deals on their platform, and they watched how people were using it, and they actually pivoted their product in that direction. Yelp was the same way. It was originally an automated email recommendation system that would send people recommendations about where to go, and then they found that people within their community were actually emailing out to others local recommendations about where to eat and where to see things in a city. So you want to monitor usage, because you might find out people are using your product in a different way than you expected. So we recently have thought about, well, what if we supported files better? How do we actually build a product that's better for file support? Is that even a problem? And it would be important if we could see, and we've looked at this, do people upload PNGs and JPEGs and GIFs? Or do people upload PDFs and docs and XLS files? And it turns out it's more the latter, fortunately. But if it were the former and it was more around photos, that might suggest a different type of product that needs to be built to support the files use case. And then driving vision, again, like if we only looked at data and if we only listened to customers, it's the classic, Henry Ford quote, right? Where they would have just asked for faster horses. So it's really hard when you're building an enterprise product, though, and you're trying to get revenue through the door. And if people don't buy into your vision, or if they just disagree with the data you're presenting or what have you, how do you possibly convince them of where you think the product is going? Again, in the case of Inbox, it was hard. A lot of people were outraged when we first released it, and it was a massive change to the product. But we want to be a place where work gets done, right? Not just a water cooler for your company, as otherwise it's really easy to make the product into. So for us, we have this vision, and in the first version that we released, it didn't even test that hot. Same thing happened with Facebook and Timeline. When it first released, they did a test, and they found out that it actually wasn't great for engagement, but they were committed to it, and they iterated on it, and they eventually got to where they thought it needed to be. So I would challenge you all to ask, where is your vision for your product, and how do you balance what you're hearing from customers with the vision that you have? And sometimes you do need to build a bridge for your customers. Like we haven't gone, one of our goals also is to simply, sort of replace some of the bad things about email, right? The reply alls and the long DLs that just go on forever. But we can't just say, okay, we just are going to resist this entirely, and we're now working on things that'll help email and Yammer play nicer together. So think about how you can build a bridge for your users to get them towards that vision. So the next area is product experiments, and this is inspired by largely the whole lean startup movement, right? So many of you, like raise your hand if you're not familiar with lean. I guess asking the question that way kind of discourages anybody from raising their hand. Maybe I should ask questions more that way. So anyway, basically, here you would think we're a 500-person company now, right? And our product team, if you include product and engineering, is something like 150 people. So you might think we're the last people to be able to practice lean, but it's actually becoming increasingly important in the enterprise, right? It's always been the case that it takes some time for things to move from consumer to enterprise. And sometimes, it's true, not everything makes it over even from consumer, for better or worse. Although I'm sure somebody out there is building like an enterprise Snapchat. But regardless of that, actually I know it exists already. But the point here is that you have to now actually build the best software. You can't just have a great sales pitch and hope that it's going to land and that somebody's just going to stay with you for the next 10 years. Yammer's been able to ride this wave, and I mentioned earlier, we actually have internal tools where we see when a network's picking up. They might not have used it for, say, the past 2 months, and then all of a sudden, wow, like Disney has 3,000 people using us in the last week. What's going on there? And we can go in and then close a deal based on that. You can also retain somebody. They're like, hey, we're not sure if we want to renew Yammer. You say, well, you've had like 1 million messages posted in the past month. Like, you should probably think about that twice. So building the best product actually really, really matters now. And the only way in the current product development world that people see you getting there is by building small things, experimenting, learning, and then ultimately you incrementally get to the best product. So basically it breaks down into like having a hypothesis, building what's called an MVP, minimum viable product, iterating on that. And then this last point might sound obvious, but in the enterprise, it's very common that people just build more and more features, right? So if you're out there struggling right now with your SaaS startup, and I've been there before, I'm sure you're thinking, oh, if we just add this one more thing, or competitor X has 10 checkboxes, we're only at 7, we need to get to 11 by next Monday. And just think more and more is better. I'll go through a short anecdote with Inbox about how we built something. It was completely neutral, and as many people, or many people wanted to argue, well, it's obviously better. I was actually the PM arguing that, so I know it for a fact. But we had nothing to support that it was actually better, so we killed the thing and we moved it out, and the product's much better for it. So I'll go through the details around that, but only make your product better is actually an incredibly hard thing to practice, because especially when you're small too and you don't have data, you don't know whether something's better or worse, so you just add more stuff. So what does it mean to have a hypothesis around? I mean, and you guys all know the scientific method from middle school, so like everybody knows what a hypothesis is. But what do you think the hypothesis was when, I don't know, Microsoft added that big ribbon to the top of like Word and Excel? I don't know. They may not have had one. Somebody might have just said, well, we should have a ribbon. And if they were the most senior person, or if they had the clout to get something done, it just got done. And sure, you could say the problem is that there's a lot of actions that you can do in, say, Word. Let's just build a ribbon to put those things in there. But instead, if you reframed it and said, well, the problem is there are a lot of actions, and it's just too much maybe for people to process, you might come out with an entirely different hypothesis and solution. Maybe we should have less functionality and focus instead on the 99% instead of building everything and throwing everything out about simplicity and elegance. You might say, well, the hypothesis should actually be a different, my hypothesis is that if we build the ribbon, that will somehow get people to engage more, and you'd realize the insaneness in that statement. How is a ribbon going to make people engage with your product more necessarily? If it made it easier to use, sure, but it would force questions that should be asked about whether or not what you're building is really solving the core problem. So in the case of Inbox, again, there was this problem. There's too much content. So you could say, well, one hypothesis is if we build an inbox, it'll allow people to actually manage their content better. You could say we should like only force people to post things that really, really matter. But that would, of course, reduce the amount that people actually used our product and shared. So there's a problem with that. You could say that the feed should just be this amazing algorithm, and then people won't have as hard of a time getting through their actual messages. And then the problem with that is how do you build this ridiculously amazing algorithm that's going to somehow know what's important to people and what's not? You could try. And we've done things to improve our feed and build that. But it was a different problem that we were trying to solve. And so this sort of framework for thinking will help you actually figure out whether or not what you're building is solving the thing that you're trying to solve for. So like MVP, how do you possibly take a concept like MVP and apply it to the enterprise? Uh, like Lean, they promote this idea of like, oh, just put up a landing page, right? Just put up a button that doesn't work and see how many people click on that. There's no way you could get away with that in the enterprise. My job would be much easier if we could. So I was the PM on chat, for example, and chat's tricky. Like, do we just have a link somewhere that says chat, like in this Lean idea, or do we have to go ahead and actually build a pretty functional chat client? And wait, we actually have to make sure that we can release that to specific networks, because what if you're chatting with somebody but they don't have chat, so they just get a private message? It's not going to be really real time. So what MVP means in the enterprise is certainly adapted from Lean, but it means something different because you have real customers who are paying you money and they don't want to see a button that doesn't work, right? And you have to validate your hypotheses somehow without going and building something that takes 6 months. So I mentioned earlier, all of our projects stay within 2 to 10 weeks. If you're a startup, or even if you're not, I'd encourage you to think about what is your release cycle and how long do you take building things, and can you build things in a smaller fashion that lets you validate faster. We recently kicked around the idea of building like a priority inbox. You all are probably familiar with that from Gmail. And there are many complicated ways that we could build it, but then we figured out a way, well, what if we focus on X and Y as really simple ways to understand if priority even means something for our users. It might seem obviously good. If you're a product person, you might say, oh, of course it's good. And if you're not a product person, you might be even more likely to say, of course it's good. But you really want to test out things as fast as possible. So we often will release to say 20% of our user base, give it a couple weeks, see whether or not something worked, and understand, oh, inbox actually is really good for people. We, in this particular case, happened to actually overbuild. We took a long time building it. We changed a lot of things at once, which makes it impossible almost to tell what worked and what didn't work. And it led to a really long analysis period that we would have been better off if we could have avoided. So this concept of iterate. So this is adapted from a blog post from our head of engineering, Chris Gale, who writes and talks a lot about iterative development and how we build product here. So if you, as soon as you're working with at least one other person, so say it's you and your co-founder, you probably have some difference of opinion about your product, right? Whether you should build this feature, is your product this or that? You're probably going to waste a lot of time arguing about these different visions and how you should spend the next 12 months, unless you think about how to build it in smaller chunks and get there eventually. So this is related to the MVP concept. But so, with something like Yammer, again, when it first launched, it didn't have file support. It didn't have threading, so you couldn't see the comments on things. It was literally just quick status updates. There's a number of things that just were missing, if you will. And it's even harder with enterprise than consumer startups to have missing things, right? It's like, well, nobody's going to take us seriously if we try to sell them this half-baked product. But the more time you spend arguing about like long-term vision and building products that you don't know anybody's going to use or not, the more you're just setting yourself up for failure, because it's going to be a lot harder to sell. You're much better off just going, honestly, even with a pitch deck and saying, well, here are a couple mock-ups where we think it might go. Are you interested in the future? They don't even have to necessarily give you their credit card or sign a letter of intent necessarily, although that would be great. But you really want to focus on how do you gradually get to where you want to be. And again, with Inbox, for example, we overbuilt at first, and then we built other things on top of it, though, and we tried to do those in as small chunks as possible, and that's been really helpful for us as we've gone along. So when you're a startup, or even if you're at a big enterprise software company, your resources are always constrained, and the more you think this way, and it's hard to get, say, your boss or your team to think this way if they don't already think that way, but the more you do, the more time you're likely to save. And notice how, where we ended up is neither of the 2 points, right? And that's the advantage of like cloud enterprise software, is that you can A/B test things, you can iterate gradually, and you'll never be able to guess. Like if we had those 2 visions, say 2 co-founders on an enterprise SaaS company, we would have never guessed that we would have ended up where we actually did. And that's the thing, is that you want to be able to adapt fast and really pick up on what people are using your product for. And we've killed things. So for example, we built something called Ideas in the early days of Yammer. And it seemed great. It's like, oh, this idea thing, you could post about like ideas you have for your company, and an employee can post something really great and get recognized, and they'll get promoted, and it'll be a great story. But something like less than 2% of our users use it. And it used to be in that publisher at the top where you can post a message. When we removed it, it was actually good for engagement. So over time, though, we've iterated on the product and said, because iterate also means killing things. And that might sound counterintuitive for enterprise software, too, because more always seems like better. Leading right into this. Like, I would never want to carry this in my pocket, and I hope nobody here would either. And more importantly, I hope nobody has one of these. Again, it's counterintuitive, but like enterprise software is changing, and it's not just more about more, and there is a real cost to adding features. There have been a lot of experiments that have been run in both our product and others that have shown when you add something, it seems like a great idea on paper, and it's not really. So, for example, I was mentioning inbox before. So we built this thing, inbox filters, so it let you see your private messages separately from your group messages. Seemed like a great idea, but it just added more clutter to the page. And when we A/B tested it, nobody used it, and it was slightly negative for some good metrics that we care about too. But still, there was the argument: oh, filters, we need it. And you can have executives asking for it, you can have big customers asking for it. But in the long term, if you just add stuff into your product, it's going to be harder to post a message. It's going to be harder to search for something. It's going to be harder to follow another user. Like, there is a cost to adding things, even though it might not seem like it. There's also the fact that you have to then QA it, like quality assurance. You have to test it in the future. There's added complexity by adding things to your products. So you have to make sure that whatever you're building is really moving the needle forward, because it's not enough to just say it's an extra feature, we can charge for it. So how do you use your customers as partners? So again, whether you just have prospects, whether you have real customers who are paying you real money, the thing about enterprise is that you actually have people really bought into your product, right? They don't want you going anywhere. For our Yammer networks, if we just shut down tomorrow, right, and said, oh, screw it, major talent acquisition, 500 people, we're all going to go work for Microsoft, and the product's going away, as opposed to the product, still being here and still growing the way it is today, they would all be really, really angry. Because their companies actually depend on it. And in the enterprise, that anger also can be channeled as enthusiasm when you're doing good things for your customers. So that enthusiasm and that information about how people are actually using your product, right? So you can get plenty out of data, but we talked earlier about how customers sometimes see things that we may not, and it's important to be open to that. So how do you work with these customers for an enterprise product, right? Asking questions is tremendously important, and it's scary because of that sort of yes sir, yes ma'am mentality that a lot of people bring to the enterprise. They're like, well, they asked for it, we built it, everybody's going to be happy. But if you're not asking the right questions, nobody's going to really be paying for your software 5 years from now. So it's really important. We do small surveys on our website. We send out our user researchers to sit with our customers, watch them email 50 people in an hour and say, well, is there a better way to do that? And they might say no, and you ask them, well, why do you think that? And it's really like, it's surprising to some people how user research is actually critically important to enterprise software. And again, with the inbox thing, we asked really hard questions and said, well, why do you feel like you have trouble? And sometimes it almost seems like a therapy session, the amount that you have to dig into somebody's like use of your product. But the more you do it, the more something extremely insightful could come out of it. You might be building like a CRM tool that might be better off repurposed as, I don't know, like some random inventory tracking system for a shipping company. And like, how do you get from A to B? I don't know, but you're not going to get there if you're not asking your customers how they're actually using your product. Keep them posted. So this is the other side of the whole A/B testing, iterative development thing, is that you actually have to really communicate with your customers if you expect to get anything. Well, if you expect them to stay your customers, for one. So we, for example, have the Yammer customer network. So I would recommend if your company doesn't already have something like this, consider it. So it's basically a Yammer network where we have customers chiming in about how they're using the product, asking questions. And it's crazy. You end up finding that they actually start helping each other. So the same case when we released Inbox, some people were like, I hate this. This sucks. Like, this is ruining our company. And then you have somebody from Molson Coors jump in and say, hey, that's interesting. This is how we're using it at Molson Coors. Have you considered that? Not only is it way more authentic than you saying, well, this is John from Enterprise Software Company who wants you to still be our customer and not be mad at us. Here's what you should do. So it's very authentic, but it's also actually legitimately powerful in the sense that customers, like I said, use your product differently than you expect them to. So somebody might actually have answers to questions that you don't have answers to. And so the authenticity and the value of those answers is ridiculously powerful. So we communicate through the YCN, the Yammer Customer Network, as well as we have what's called a success network. So before we test something, we post about it and say, hey, we're going to be A/B testing this thing in the next 2 weeks. You're aware of it. It's a place to inform your customers about what's going on. If you just change things around and they have no heads up about it, can't really get away with doing that for too long. So I would try to avoid an angry mob, keep people posted. That doesn't mean spamming them with email. There's like good ways that you can keep people engaged. So I was surprised that I found an image that represented pushing back in the enterprise as well as I think this one does. But this was a case where we failed to do this with that inbox filters thing. I mentioned we heard a bunch of angry people. We were like, oh, well, we don't like angry people. It was a little more complicated than that, but let's build this thing to appease them. And we didn't push back hard enough. If we dug into what their problems were, if we really researched the data more, it turns out that people actually don't have a ton of private messages necessarily. So why would we have a separate toggle basically for seeing your private messages from your group messages? It wouldn't necessarily get used that much. So not only did it not move any of our core metrics in our A/B tests, but like I mentioned, the actual people who asked for it, you would call them up and they would say, yes, I'm using this, I love it. And then you would look at the data and they have never clicked on the thing. So you have to push back. And it's something that you have to educate your customers about. It's part of the whole development methodology. But eventually people get that, oh, they actually know what they're doing and they'll value you as a partner and a real product person. Otherwise, you're just selling them something. We're going to do Q&A after, but is it? Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the short answer is that, I mean, oh, sorry. Good point. So the question is basically, and correct me if I misphrase it, but how do you push back when sometimes you have one or two big customers who account for, say, all of your revenue, and they're asking for these things that you're pushing back on? But so I don't want to be the reason that your enterprise startup goes from, say, $1 million of revenue to zero by pushing back. But I will say that in the early days, you know, for example, Yammer was asked to build an on-premise version. So like not build cloud basically. And there was a lot of money that was being thrown at the company in its infancy as well. So it wasn't like, oh, Yammer's like a thing we can turn down, whatever. It could have changed the trajectory of the company. But we turned it down because there was a certain vision for where enterprise software was going, why we should build in the cloud and so on. And had we done that, you know, I can't predict what would have necessarily happened, but I can't imagine the amount of engineering resources we would have had to put to support that thing going forward, and how we would have never got to the product that we ended up building. So whether it's on-premise, whether it's an integration with some crazy, you know, I mentioned the legacy systems before. At the end of the day, if you customize your product too much, you're basically just a consultant, and you're basically just doing custom development for every client, and you're not really building a products business. So, and it's just a services thing, right? So again, I mean, if you're doing tons of revenue by just adhering to what people ask for and that's working for you, it's great. But I will say that in Yammer's case, having the fortitude to say no led to a much bigger success than anybody could have seen if they had just said, sure, we'll build an on-prem version. So you really do have to push back, and it's hard. And I can say I was the product manager on the inbox filters thing, and I didn't push back enough. I just said, well, people are angry. I was a relatively new PM here. I didn't want people here to not like me. And like, sure, like let's build the thing. It always seems like a better thing to just build the thing. And that's when a lot of these lessons really came out for me. So pushing back would have saved us, say, a month of engineering time. It would have saved customers from having to get used to this new thing that we then took back from them. It would have saved our designers having to figure out how to make inbox work with all these filters. And imagine if we kept it as a neutral feature. Then you have to build it into the iPad app, the iPhone app, figure out how to make filters work for all these various things. And that goes back to the complexity cost of just adding more stuff. So pushing back is just, it's important, you know, to really understand like what is the goal here and what are you trying to get out of the product, and then figure out what your vision is for your company. Do you want to just be a services company that consults for people, or do you want to build a highly scalable product? So I mentioned evangelists. So whether it's the YCN, which is again the Yammer customer network, or whether it's people out there who go and change from company A to company B, and now get company B to use Yammer, like in the enterprise, because you don't have the same virality channels that you might have in consumer, getting people to love your software is incredibly important, right? Because people go to conferences, they have forums that they talk about this software in, and it might not be as many people using your software, but they're probably more influential on an individual level. So if you can create people who really are passionate about your product, we've had people send us cupcakes with like the Y and the spittle on it, and like we've sent like baby onesies to people, like customers who we know just had babies and stuff. And create a real relationship with those customers. And with something that could otherwise be criticized as a toy, something that requires a lot of work to get people. I mean, many people raised their hands before and said, I asked, have you used Yammer? I didn't ask, are you using Yammer every day, right? So getting people to use your product every day and really love it is a whole nother level. And that comes by creating people who are evangelists for your product and who have a deep commitment to it. For a lot of people, Yammer isn't just, they don't even think of it as enterprise software. They use it, like they actually identify with, oh, Yammer, I love it, I use it. I mean, that's not always true. I'm not trying to toot our own horns here. But like, there's a relationship that gets formed with something that can actually be something that does get somebody promoted or does save you 3 months of engineering time or whatever it is. So figure out a way, if you can, to not just focus on, oh, how do we optimize the sign-up funnel? How do we drive, monetization? Those are all important questions, but don't forget the human aspect that actually does exist in enterprise software and how to make your customers evangelists. So I think we're running a little bit ahead of time, but hopefully you guys have questions. Otherwise, you can drink enough beer to make your $5 or $10 tickets worth it. But I think we'll stop at that for now, and hopefully the question section will allow for a bit more dialogue about how we build product. Thanks. So I think we have a second mic that we're gonna float around, but I think if you don't have a mic and whatever, you can also feel free to yell it out, and I'll just repeat the question. But Greg is gonna otherwise hand out.
I'll throw around the mic. So it looks like we'll have one here, and then we've got a couple over there. So I'll make my way over there as well.
Hi, Ajay here. So question is, how did Yammer acquire the first few customers?
That's a great question. So to be honest, a lot of it, and first of all, to be frank, I wasn't even here then. So this is stuff I know from folklore, if you will. A lot of it was like personal relationships. The company launched at TechCrunch 50 though, which got us a lot of press. And the first few customers came out of there. So it's a mix, and our founder, David Sachs, is like a Silicon Valley legend at this point. So he also was able to make some things happen. We had investors who could make customer introductions. And many of those early customers are still with us, but it was a mix of press and relationships and selling people on a vision for the product because, like I said, it really wasn't that much to begin with. Yeah.
Sorry, one second. Here we go.
You mentioned A/B testing, and from a technical standpoint, A/B testing is very difficult to implement. So I'd like to know a little more about like how you implement A/B testing, and I understand the value of it, but from a social network, what are the challenges, and what have you learned from that?
Okay, so just to rephrase, basically, it sounds like how do you implement A/B testing, especially because there's a cost associated with it. As much as I can stand up here and preach about it, unless it's actually something that can be implemented reasonably, nobody's going to do it. And then for a social network, what are the unique challenges with A/B testing? Okay, so like I said, we have like a custom in-house solution. So we use, for data, we use a system called Vertica, which is like a data warehouse. And that's probably really boring for most people, I guess, to hear about. So I won't spend that much time on like what we do internally. But I will say that like, whether it's Mixpanel or Optimizely or some of the other publics, or even Google Analytics does enable A/B testing now, you can do this somewhat cheaply. It's harder to do it when you get into like really advanced features that aren't as simple as like a toggle here and a toggle there. But there are tools out there, public tools that make it easier for an enterprise software or any software product to try to do A/B testing. For social network, there are a number of challenges, right? Like we run multiple tests at one time, right? So how do you make sure that there's not conflating factors behind what drives engagement? There's measuring different metrics and weighing them against each other, right? So what happens, especially, this also varies whether you're a young product or a more mature product, but so a few of our key metrics are engagement, retention, and virality, right? So do people engage with your product? Do you retain people over a certain period of time? And do people refer other people, right? Or invite other people, and do you convert them? What happens if you have a feature that, say, increases virality but decreases engagement with your product, right? Especially for a social network where it's like, well, of course we need more people, but wait a minute, those people that we're bringing through the door aren't going to use us that much. So as an enterprise product, as a social network, I think weighing different metrics together, communicating to customers, again, about this sort of stuff, because as much as we educate them, it's still hard to say, like, hey, like we took away that thing you're using, but maybe we'll bring it back in a few weeks if it tests well. That's not an idea that they're used to. And then there's the idea of, well, if you're testing a lot of things, how do you actually suss out what had X impact and what was just noise? We've had tests that have nothing to do with virality that lift the number of invites sent, and it required, but I mean, a product manager who doesn't know what they're doing, which was me for a long time, was saying, well, great, the feature is amazing, we should definitely ship it out. Somebody who's a little smarter than that would say, well, wait a minute, let's dig into the data, and they would find out that it was actually just noise, and it could have been like, say, one person in one of the treatment groups who invited like 1,000 people and threw everything off, which in our product actually isn't that hard to do because we have a way to invite most people in your company.
I will add one point to that. Early in our existence, we had to fight a big battle because we test among just a percentage of users across all Yammer networks. So if you're a paying company and a massive company like Deloitte, for example, you may have 2% of your users that are seeing something completely different, and they're asking you as the Yammer admin or you as the Yammer owner what to do and how they should be using this new feature. So our ability to communicate the benefits of the long-term vision of what A/B testing would do, and that we're overall trying to create an engaging product, a more engaging product, was absolutely key, especially for our largest paying customers. And it wasn't easy. For a while, we had some complexity on the back end where particular networks that complained to a certain degree were turned off from A/B testing, but we ultimately talked them through over a long period of time. So now when we release something, there's no networks that are exempt from that, but it was a challenge.
You can just, okay, I'll just jump in a second. Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question. So at this point, we test on all users when we release a test. Because whether you're free or paid, who knows? You might become paid at some point, right? And we don't want to degrade the experience. And also, if you're paid, or sorry, if you're free, we want you to be paid. So we want you to have a good experience. And if we don't test on you, and something is only good, say, for free users or only good for paid users, that creates a real, our freemium pipeline would be worse. Our paid users we might turn our paid users almost into different users than our free users if we did that. For a long time, we did only test on free users, actually. It was only in the past year and a half, in my time here, that we shifted away from that because we realized that while we do believe, and we did tests to verify this, that our free users are representative of our paid users, it's a much more sound test when you can say, well, we did test on all users, and it was because we got to that place with our customers over time of saying, this is how we build product, this is why it's better for you, and this is just how it's basically going to be. So anyway, at this point, we test on all users because it's most representative, but you're right to ask it because for a long time, and some of you may go through this, when you have paid users saying, I don't want you to test on me, basically, you might be put in the position of having to test on free users. And if you do have to make that concession, it's really important to then validate that your free users are actually representative of your paid users, because otherwise you could end up releasing something that's bad for your user base because it tested well on, say, a small segment of free users.
Question in the back.
Let's do a follow-up real quick and then. So the question was, what's our confidence point? So this goes into like p-values and statistics and stuff like that. So without geeking out too much about data, it's usually around like a 0.2 or 0.1 p-value below that we consider significant.
Back to the engagement question real quick. So one of the first things you said is enterprise is hard because you've got disparate buying groups from user groups. And so you're trying to establish benchmarks on engagement. How do you kind of get to a point where you're like, this level of engagement constitutes good enough to get the renewal for the buyer group? How have you gotten smarter about that over time?
Sure. So honestly, that's the first time I've ever thought about that question. So whatever comes out of my mouth now could be good or bad. So probably a caveat for everything else I've said. So there's a couple things. One is that as you have customers and as you can actually start to then look at what happened to that customer before they upgraded and after they upgraded, you start to get a sense. So in our case, we can look at number of messages posted, number of groups created. These things lead to somebody basically upgrading and are good indicators of that. And once you have that, then you can go back and look at, okay, well, what other types of behaviors should we be encouraging? I'm not sure if this answers your question, by the way, so you can call me out if it doesn't. But in terms of defining like a benchmark for engagement that's like good or something that would drive somebody towards being premium. Once you actually have a few customers, you can see how they use your product. And it's true that some features that we have don't correlate very well necessarily to monetization. So we don't necessarily focus on, I mean, at this point, monetization is something that is part of the larger Microsoft family and how we like integrate with that suite and so on. But prior to the acquisition, we were building a feature called premium groups, which we saw there's group usage, and we can get people to pay for premium, like extra features basically in those groups. And that was based on the data that we had on customers that had upgraded previously. But let me know if that answered your question or not. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, so to repeat. Okay, so basically in the context of a renewal, right? So somebody pays you for say a year, and then their contract's up for renewal the next year. And say in the case of Yammer, say if it's a company of 5,000 people and only say 100 of them are using it, how do we measure engagement to know whether or not that usage is good enough for a renewal? Yeah. Well, honestly, I mean, we sort of drive as far as possible, right? Like we want people to use our product 7 days a week and so on. But it is true that in a lot of cases, like we're not fully saturated in companies, right? So we say that, you know, oh, the XYZ Fortune 500 company uses this. In many cases, it's not necessarily even a majority of the entire company. So for us, in terms of how we think about renewals, I think we try to drive more engagement in the product. We realize that oftentimes it's not going to be fully saturated. And so we sometimes instead think about, well, of the people who are using the product, what does engagement look like for them? And then for the buyer, what is their goal? Are they trying to drive like a cross-company intranet? Is that the goal for the product? And if it is, then maybe it's more about the volume rather than deep engagement. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that no matter what enterprise software you're building, it's probably unrealistic to, you can aim for like 100% saturation, but it's pretty common to see much lower numbers than that. And people will renew oftentimes even if that's not the case. Yeah. 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 So there's two questions wrapped in that. So basically the question is, how do you, for one, tease out what engagement is due to your product versus say them promoting your product inside of the company? Well, I think that's mainly it, right? So for us, so we have something called customer success managers actually. So when we have somebody sign up for our product, they work with them very hands-on to say, you know, we throw these things called Yam Jams where you get everybody together, you teach them about the product, you get them online at once, people sign up for accounts. And of course, that does a way better job oftentimes than, you know, sending somebody like an email saying, hey, sign up for Yammer, right? And at that point, we don't have necessarily something that says, well, this customer just had what's called CSM, Customer Success Manager, go over there, let's discount engagement by 15% or whatever. Because even engagement itself, that's this like broad term that breaks into very specific things. Days engaged in a week, messages posted, a whole number of things like that. So anyway, I think it's an important challenge to think about. It's very hard to quantify the impact because even then, you know, if you have one CSM go and another CSM go, you might see better engagement with the first one and the other one, if they don't like their job or if they're having a bad day, they might not actually do a great job of promoting the product. So it becomes very hard to suss out. So long story short, it's something to keep in mind, but it wouldn't be something that we would obsess over and think about like, oh, actually they sent a CSM over there, and so we can't include any of this engagement because we test things across such a broad base of users that we can usually attribute it to the feature itself as opposed to just, oh, they happen to have a champion over there right now, right? Our tests tend to see hundreds of thousands or millions of people engage with it. So even if a network was experiencing like some sort of cheating, if you will, in terms of engagement because they had somebody helping them at the time, we don't end up really seeing any effect of that because we have such a broad base that we're testing on. I realize that's not helpful if you're a startup with like 2 customers, but yeah. Sure. So the question is, besides CSMs, customer success managers, what else do we do to foster initial engagement with the product? I can tell you a number of things we've tested. Some that have tested poorly, and so we killed them, and some that are still there. So we have like a getting started list in the product when you first sign up. So I would consider that. I was just talking to like a mobile security company the other day, and they have like a 1, 2, 3 wizard basically of how to, because mobile security is hard. How do you get, like if somebody signs up for this thing, how do you get them to configure devices and do all this stuff in one sitting? So anyway, so we have a getting started list. We've tested tooltips in the product to guide people through that experience. In our case, they actually didn't test so hot, so they're not there anymore. That's another thing to keep in mind, is that something that tested well for one product may very well not test well for your product, right? So we tested tooltips, didn't work out so well. We've tested and we've added something that some of you may have seen that fosters sort of what's called peer getting started. So we leverage other people in the network. So if you're a new user and you haven't uploaded a profile photo yet, you can ask that person for a photo. And you can also see that some users have like a new badge on their face, basically on their avatar. So it encourages other people to say, oh, Jimmy's new to our Yammer network. Like, and we post a welcome post when somebody joins the network as well. So like a system generated, like so-and-so has joined the network, and it creates more content that other people. So when we get like a new hire or something like that, and they join the Yammer network, there's like this long thread saying, oh, welcome to Yammer, where are you from, blah, blah, blah. And it creates this great engagement loop too then, right? Because they're drawn back into the product because now somebody's replying to them, and then I might see it because it's gonna bubble up in my feed because it's a very active conversation. So there are a number of ripple effects from that. So we've done a few things in the product outside of having sort of hand-holding that comes with having a customer success manager. And again, for like early stage startups, let alone like most startups don't hire a PM until they're like past 50 people, let alone a CSM. So you have to think about these in-product things. So I would say the getting started list, a new user badge, system generated messages. We were working on like email drip campaigns, right? So say like a few days after somebody signs up, you say, hey, we noticed you signed up for Yammer. Come make your first post or create your first group or what have you. And we've thought about experimenting with that on mobile. How do you do a push notification that draws somebody in that's not necessarily one of those like annoying like zombie game push notifications that says like you haven't killed a zombie in 7 days, come back and waste more time. But there are a number of things in the product that you can do to educate your users.
You've told several interesting war stories around A/B testing versus enterprise expectations of fairly stable product. Do you have, in a similar vein, do you have any stories, good or bad, around the impact of frequent small changes, the sort of continuous deployment thing versus enterprise expectations of big bang releases?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I'm not sure which anecdote would be best, but we've definitely avoided, at other companies I've talked to, when they do say a 6-month release cycle or 3-year release cycle for that matter, they build up all these expectations over time. They build the thing, they release it, and then it's buggy. And they never got to that because they built so many things together at the same time. So it's almost the absence of a war story almost that's been the like result of this sort of continuous deployment here, where maybe like the service goes down for like an hour over the weekend, somebody gets somebody on our ops team gets something on PagerDuty and it's like, oh, you gotta come and like fix this thing or whatever. But because we do continuous deployment, we don't have like so much code going out at once, so it reduces the amount of risk and complexity that we have. So honestly, it's the absence of me having a time like, oh, the site went down this one time because we took 2 years to build everything at once and just shipped it out the door, and none of it worked the way we thought it would. So that's probably the best I could say is honestly the absence of that sort of experience.
How do you select the metrics to use? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not really. For example, do you want customers to spend a lot of time on your product? If you're Facebook, you probably do. If you're Google, you don't. So how do you do when it's not so obvious?
Argue. When it's not so obvious, I mean, we have a very meritocratic culture where if you don't think that something's impactful. So one time we heard about like, I don't know, we heard in big companies that they wanted the ability to merge groups together, right? And many customers have also asked for hierarchy in groups, right? We want this like IT group that then has another layer to it that is for the Americas and for EMEA and so on. And then we want another layer for the, and when we think about things like that, we're like, well, what impact is this actually going to have? And of course, so that's the more obvious one, right? It's like, well, it's probably not going to. Maybe it would do something for engagement, but if you're saying maybe, you're already kind of making an argument against yourself. So when it's not as obvious, I think we try to drill down into like, what are we really trying to do here? And are we actually meeting that goal or not. I know that sounds really like simple, but if you do frame it as that, so I mentioned it earlier. What if something drives up, say, virality, but it hits engagement? You have to think through, well, what was the goal? And if we say built a change to, I don't know, the way that you invite people, and it boosted virality, okay, it accomplished its goal, and then what's the magnitude of the effect that it had? So suppose it's like, I don't know, say days engaged, right? So the number of days in a week that somebody engages with our product, if that goes down by say 0.2%, virality is up by 5%, it becomes a little easier. So I realize that if you have a non-obvious scenario in mind, feel free to share it. But it's usually something in that framework will sort of not spit out an answer. It's never that clean, but it's along the lines of that.
You talked about killing features. How do you kill a feature and not make those people who are using them, really unhappy? And how do you deal with those things?
Yeah, well, for one, you just become a product manager and let somebody else in the organization deal with it. Just kidding. So that's a great question because it's hard, right? Because people will be angry about it and so on. So there's a few things. I mentioned educating the user base about how we build product and the customers. So people, for one, we get an advantage because people are starting to have this expectation and they know that when we do something like that, it's going to be good for them. But that's not enough, right? Because suppose you have a personal attachment and you're the IT buyer at like, I don't know, Ford or something like that. And so it's not going to be enough to buy into the methodology. So then there's the whole advanced warning, like, hey, we're testing this thing. Here's why we're doing it. And then it comes down to saying, well, here's the data that suggests that people in your network are actually more active now, even though we killed this thing. And you often find that it's really just a vocal minority. And it's really hard to just say, well, it's just a vocal minority because they're yelling in your ear, or it's you're a big customer or what have you. But we've found time and time again that there are just a few people who are really vocal about something, and it's often misleading to let that guide what you're trying to do. So it's a mix of having people prepared, trying to inform them ahead of time and keeping them updated on what you're building, looking at the data, having the data. If you can actually show somebody, forget the fact that nobody wants to look at stats, so the moment you show them that table, they'll probably say, okay, I believe you. But in addition to that, you actually have a very objective reason for why you're doing what you're doing, and it takes away sort of the power dynamics of customer and software provider, and instead it says, well, let's talk about your users and your people at your company that you care about, and it makes it a much easier conversation. So when we killed ideas, we were able to say, well, almost nobody's using it. We have a good replacement for it. That's the other thing, right? With something like ideas, for one, you can just post a regular message, honestly, and it does pretty much the same thing. But in addition to that, other things that we kill, when we do so, we look to have our partners solve that gap for us, right? Or we point people to how they can still solve that problem, even if we remove the specific checkbox that might have done that thing. So we've thought about our events feature, for example, and we haven't killed it, but it's possible that if a partner came along and built like a fantastic enterprise eventing system or whatever, and took that burden away from us, that might be a way that we could sort of transition out of that and let somebody who's really good at a core competency focus on that, and we're just the platform for it. So anyway, it's a mix of education, keeping them posted, and then using data to try to objectify the conversation and not make it so personal, and remembering that it's usually just a vocal minority that might be upset about what you're doing. Yeah.
You mentioned that early on you decided not to support on-premise like servers and things like that,
right?
To realize your vision. Can you give me examples of other features that you pushed back on that enterprise customers traditionally wanted, and then also maybe some features that you really do need to put in an enterprise product? You can't just for example, have them all sign a user agreement or something like that. When they or privacy, obviously, and security and things like that. What are some examples of both of those?
Okay, so something that people wanted, but we decided not to build. Is that part of it? That's the first part. There's a lot in there, so I want to just break it down a little bit. So
there's a difference between an enterprise product and a consumer product.
Totally.
Right? So, for example, consumer product, everything's on one cloud on all your servers, Facebook, for example. Whereas some enterprise software, you actually have the choice of doing a cloud base on your servers versus on their intranet type server.
Sure.
And that's a choice that you decide not to do.
Right.
To go to more of the consumer side. What are some other examples of those
things that we chose decisions? Not to build because even though somebody expected?
And also, what examples of some features that you do need to have in an enterprise? You can't say, sure, we're not going to support that.
Sure. So I'll just work backwards kind of. So in terms of do need to, right? That before like before Yammer, I had basically zero enterprise experience, so this stuff was interesting to me. Data export, right? Some of your customers, because of compliance, right? So we have healthcare companies, finance companies, governmental organizations. They need to be able to export all of their Yammer data in case it's whether it's subpoenaed or otherwise. So that's one thing. Admin controls, same thing. So the ability for an admin to say restrict membership in groups or delete messages, usage policy. Again, when was the last time I mean, maybe it would be good for them if they did this, but like Facebook doesn't say like, I mean, you have terms of services, but it's like a small thing and the checkbox is sometimes pre-checked and so on. Whereas with our product, if you join some of our networks, if they have a usage policy, every user has to like agree to it before they can post in it. And it gives the company some peace of mind because they're like, oh, okay, we can like control how people use this. And we're like, it's sort of a, cover your whatever type of move because then they're not liable for certain behaviors. So those are some things we have built. In terms of pushing back on things, so I mentioned the on-prem thing. I mentioned earlier like integrations with other people's like their sort of in-house environments. We've turned on a lot of other things, but those are probably like the on-prem thing kind of changed the future of Yammer, honestly. And that was a really important decision early.
I think for enterprise too, a lot of enterprise products, a lot of customers ask for analytics and custom reporting. I think that's something we've really strayed away from because the majority of our users aren't going to be the ones looking at these dashboards. You might have a couple people that are looking at analytics and stuff like that, but it's something that, from my experience, I've been in a couple enterprise companies, and we always go down that route of, hey, let's get reporting, let's get crystal reports, BI, all this stuff. We did none of that. And we have a question over here.
You talked about kind of your workflow. You have engineers, you have the data specialist, and then you're the product manager. Are you the UX designer? Is that kind of waterfall later in the equation, or where's your kind of workflow there?
So here, no, I'm not. We have UX designers. We also have UI designers. For those that don't know, UX is user experience, UI is user interface, right? So imagine like, so the early stage wireframes, this is how the thing works. That's UX, and then the polished, Photoshop file that you hand off to a front-end engineer, that's UI. They work very closely together though, and some of our designers do both. So here, it's rare that the PMs will actually do design, but we work extremely closely together because, right, like the PM, or say if you're the founder of your startup and you're working with a designer, there's you kind of have to come together on what the vision is for what are the goals of the thing. Like I care about metrics. I also care about users, but our designers might care more about users even though they understand metrics and care about them as well. But we're just talking about the same thing, just in different language at the end of the day. It's like, oh, I want to drive up engagement. And they're like, I want people to use our product more. And it's really the same thing. So yeah, anyway, here, PMs don't tend to do actual design, but we work very, very closely together. Yeah, in the green shirt.
In regards to like continuous deployment, how do you communicate the impacts of the continuous deployment to your support teams?
We use Yammer for one, and people, and that's just the way we work. So you're talking about our in-house support teams, basically, that both handle like inbound customer support, as well as we also have a separate support team that actually fixes bugs and manages support there. So yeah, honestly, we all have been sort of indoctrinated now into the way that we build and ship product, and so everybody knows there's like a release schedule. There's what's called a release Bible that gets posted. It's like an announcement into engineering, so it's impossible to not be aware that a release is going out and these are the changes to it. So yeah, honestly, it's a matter of expectations and sort of company culture and what we're used to, and then some tactical things like announcing something and pumping it into, say, Zendesk, or using basically the tools that we already have.
So that release Bible, is that at the end of every sprint, or like what's the cycle for your release Bible?
So it's like it's an ongoing Yammer note basically, and so every week now we're doing twice a week deploys. So that just gets updated. There's an announcement about it. There's like a funny GIF that goes along with it, and then everybody has a beer and goes home.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's basically.
So I think we're going to take one more question, and then we have actually a couple other product managers here. If you guys could just raise your hand. So if you guys have other questions, we don't want to just bombard Jason and waste everybody else like kind of sitting here and getting boring. But we'll take one more question, and then everybody can start asking the other product managers questions as well.
Okay, well, I wasn't hoping to be the last question, but
Pressure's on.
Great.
We're all looking at you right now.
Yeah, this is pretty awkward. in terms of Yammer as a entity, what is the marketing strategy, and are there any segments of other enterprises and industries that you guys try to stay away from? I'm thinking things that are legacy that you're like, all right, we're not even going to touch that right now because there's no way they're going to integrate Yammer. And how has your overall marketing strategy changed since the acquisition?
Sure. So I'll work backwards again, I guess. In terms of like how things have changed, particularly from a marketing standpoint since the acquisition. I mean, now there's the whole like Microsoft One story, right? It's like, well, we're releasing something soon that allows you to open up your doc and your PowerPoint or whatever inside of Yammer, right? And like, oh, Yammer will play well with these other services within Microsoft. So now it's about, well, we have social and we have all this other stuff. Not long before this, like say, I mean, even post-acquisition, we had this sort of cloud intranet push where that was just because it sells well, right? Because people get the intranet thing and they get the, like, it was just easier for people to grok. There are other phases that we've had, but those are probably the most two like recent ones to call out. And we organize our product team around that, right? When we did the cloud intranet, we worked on like a new navigation. We worked on what was called like official content, right? That allowed administrators to lock down a file or the owners of files to lock things down. And that allowed us to tell the story about the cloud intranet. So that's in terms of how our marketing has shifted. In terms of things we've stayed away from a product standpoint, what I could say more is there what we've stayed away from, and I think that might be more relevant. In terms of, you may have noticed, for example, Yammer doesn't necessarily have tasks, right? We don't necessarily have video chat. There are a lot of things that one could make an argument for having, but they're either extremely expensive from an engineering standpoint, they might be better solved through an integration, they might stray us a little bit further away from what our core vision is around like public and open communication. And so there are a few things that sound like great ideas, and who knows, like either where the future will take us, or maybe if anybody were to eat our lunch, maybe they'll come in and solve one of these things really well. But for us, it's a matter of what is the engineering cost, what use cases is it solving, and does it actually align with what our vision is for the product. So with that, now that I have you all aboard, thanks again for coming out, and then yeah, definitely stick around and talk with Greg, Norm, Sid from the BD team, and the rest of the Yammer folks that are around. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. You're the man. As he mentioned, as Norman mentioned, there's a few other Yammer folks as well. If you'd like to chat, we'd be more than happy to. We're here till 9, and we still have plenty of drinks and snacks, so stick around. And thank you all again for coming. We certainly appreciate it.